we have now looked at the S, the P, and the O of SPOT, the solvency deficit, the permutation, and the offense. Lastly, we have to look at the T, theory. Now, while in this video I'm not going to go in depth about what each theory argument is and how to win each theory argument, I am going to discuss briefly some of the main or bigger theory arguments that are often read against the criticism. The first one that comes to mind is the obvious one, framework. There are two main types of framework that are read in any single debate round. So the first thing is framework, and there's two different types. The first is the status quo or legitimate government counterplan. And this argument literally says you are cheating if you are negative and you are not defending the status quo or legitimate government counterplan. And they'll make arguments as to why it's not fair to defend anything else. The next one, or the other one that is becoming more popular, is we get to weigh the AF. And this type of framework argument is simply arguing that we should have political considerations and we should think about the ramifications of politics and what those decisions might do to the populace, whether it be right-wing takeover or whether it's just simply about the affirmative. So those are the two different types of framework arguments that are there. And those are just saying how should the judge kind of act and interpret sort of the information that they are being encountered with. The second big theory argument is a floating pick argument. While most people consider picks when it comes to counterplans as being good, there are many people who don't consider floating picks to be good. And what a floating pick does is it is an alternative, and in the alternative text it does not talk about the affirmative per se, but a floating pick can do the affirmative. That means that even in the world of the alternative, the affirmative plan action could be implemented. If that is the case, it's what's called a floating pick, because you don't know whether the alternative would necessarily result in the affirmative, even though it could. And the problem is that might suck up a whole lot of your affirmative offense, especially if you're going for a solvency deficit in that particular debate. A third argument is no text to the alternative. So sometimes a lot of affirmatives will demand a static sentence or two about what the alternative will be doing. Because a lot of times affirmatives will sense that an alternative, while the statement might say one thing, it will begin to morph into other things, and that the evidence says that other things are necessary. Take, for example, a reject the AF alternative can sometimes morph into more than just reject the AF. And you want to be able to make arguments as to why a simple statement of just reject the AF isn't able to solve for all the parts of the criticism, because even the alternative evidence indicates that more is necessary. And so this is a pretty standard argument when there is not a specific text to be able to nail down to. And remember, you read a plan text. They can pin you down to a specific advocacy. You argue that you should be able to do the same. Another one that is pretty big is utopian fiat. And utopian fiat argues that it's just impossible to be able to debate against a world that would be perfect. I.e., the alternative creates a perfect world through its fiat of individual mindsets, and now the world is too perfect, and it's impossible for the affirmative to be able to argue that something should be able to be done in comparison. And if that happens, it's always going to result in a negative ballot, is the argument. And so you can make some arguments as to why that utopian fiat is bad. And then the last main argument, theory argument, we're going to talk about in this video is vague alternatives. And this argument literally just says that the alternative text or the alternative is too vague. We don't understand what it means. And if you don't understand what it means, you cannot debate against it, and you cannot generate offense against it either. It would be much like if you read a vagueness argument against a plain text. So, these might not be all of the theory arguments that you could read against criticism, and these sorts of arguments are always evolving and changing and coming into fruition. However, these are 5 major arguments that people make against criticism that all show how the spot part, or the theory part of spot, can be used. So in these 4 videos, we have looked at the solvency deficit, we've looked at the permutation, we've looked at offense, and we just got done looking at theory. Hopefully now you feel more comfortable in debating against the criticism and won't be quite as intimidated now that you know there's a simple formula in order to beat a criticism when you are a policy affirmative.